NBC's Gabe Gutierrez is reporting from Atlanta, where tomorrow night's debate will be held. Also with us, David Jolly, former Republican congressman of Florida and an MSNBC political analyst. Peter Baker is New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. Okay, Gabe, where are expectations right now as these candidates prepare to face off tomorrow?
Well, Chris, they're all over the place, as you were talking about. The Trump campaign floating the idea that President Biden might somehow be on an energy drink. And this comes after months of former President Trump trying to make the case that President Biden is unfit for office. Well, now they're trying to lower expectations here. And the Biden campaign is also firing back after former President Trump over the weekend suggested that President Biden might be on some sort of performance-enhancing drugs. The Biden campaign now with a statement saying Donald Trump is so scared of being held accountable for his toxic agenda of attacking reproductive freedom and cutting Social Security that he and his allies are resorting to desperate, obviously false lies. Now, President Biden, Chris, is right now at Camp David participating in mock debates, and we're told that his campaign is preparing a robust, rapid response operation both at campaign headquarters in Delaware and also here on the ground in Atlanta to counter false and misleading claims by former President Trump. Trump, for his part, is right now at Mar-a-Lago, and his campaign is planning to bring up several topics during the debate that it feels it can hit President Biden with. Those topics include inflation and immigration. Chris?
So, Peter, when it comes to these shifting attacks that Biden will be on something, could it be viewed as a preemptive move by Republicans to set up an explanation, an excuse, if Biden is considered to be the winner of the debate?
Yeah, this is the pregame, obviously. People are looking for things to talk about and to get excited about. And as you say, set the expectations. Remember, it was Trump who was going around saying that Biden was so feeble, so senile, so doddering that he couldn't put two sentences together. So if he shows up on stage in Atlanta and obviously will be able to put more than two sentences together, then Trump has to be able to find a way to explain it. So he and his allies are, of course, looking for ways to say, well, that's because he's, on energy drinks or whatever it is. It's all the game playing that you expect before a debate. The truth is most viewers won't be paying attention to this stuff. They'll be paying attention to what they see tomorrow night on stage. And it really matters, I think, for both of them, because as you point out, this is the one event we know of for sure that will be spontaneous and unscripted with both candidates on stage. It's possible they have the second debate in September they've agreed to, but we know they're going to have this one tomorrow night, and anything can happen.
And tens of millions of sets of eyeballs watching. But David, I wonder, again, Peter's absolutely right. The expectations game is nothing new. But talking about things like, Mountain Dew. How does this help the GOP beyond the base? I mean, if the point for both of these campaigns is this is an opportunity for them to reach out to people who truly are not decided or maybe wavering for them or the other candidate, what does this accomplish?
Yeah, Chris, I see this as a very embarrassing and despicable moment for the Republican Party, kind of a timestamp of what the party has become under Donald Trump. Because recognize, sure, they're playing the expectations game, like Peter says, we see as a pretext to all debates. They're working the refs, whether that's the American people or the press. But look at what they're working the refs on, Republicans are. It's on Joe Biden's acuity, his physical capabilities, his fitness. It is not on policy. And converse that or contrast that with what Joe Biden did in his response, which was to acknowledge exactly that they're coming after the president's physical capabilities. I want to talk about reproductive freedom and the economy and protecting democracy. I think this shows that Donald Trump is truly scared going into the debate, and Republicans are scared as well, because on the issues, they're actually not that strong. The only issue that I think we'll see Donald Trump really hit home is on immigration and on the border. And on that, he'll misrepresent the facts, be it the bipartisan immigration deal or be it conflating crime numbers with the border. But I expect Donald Trump to pull a Katie Britt on immigration, try to scare the American people. But Republicans focused on Joe Biden, they're not talking policy. They're talking about his physical capabilities. It's a shameful moment for Mike Johnson and other leading Republicans right now.
And policy, of course, is one part of it, and immigration will be big. The economy, Peter, of course, will be big. But we also have new NBC News reporting that I speak to the optics of this. We've asked multiple sources in both campaigns if they expect the debate stage handshake. The consistent response is, I don't know. and we'll see tomorrow. I mean, of course, in 2020, there was no handshake because of COVID. And in 2016, Trump did not shake hands with Hillary Clinton. Do you think that kind of optic or lack of sends a message to the American people, maybe some voters who, frankly, are fed up with what's happening with politics and are deciding whether to vote at all, let alone who they're going to vote for?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You remember, of course, when President Trump was still in office and he gave his last State of the Union address, he goes to the chamber of the House of Representatives, and he refused to shake Nancy Pelosi's hand, as is traditionally done with the speaker in such a setting. So there is, of course, as you say, precedent for this, and it would be interesting to see whether they do. They both truly dislike each other. I think that is truly, genuinely a case, and it would not surprise me if neither one wants to shake the other's hand. But it says something about our politics, because other candidates in the past may not have liked each other, but they did think that there was something important about a handshake, about the idea that they were participating in an exercise of democracy, that yes, they could disagree on issues and disagree even on each other's qualifications and disagree strongly, but they were part of a system. And of course, we know that Donald Trump doesn't really believe he's part of this system. He's been trying to tear the system down, and Joe Biden is sort of the embodiment of the system at a time when, a lot of voters don't particularly like it. And I think that's sort of going to be the symbolic import of whether we see a handshake or not.
Let me ask you, too, Peter, about this new Associated Press poll. 40% of adults surveyed said they are extremely likely or very likely to watch or listen to clips from the debate later. Another 35% say they're somewhat likely to do the same. Look, I mean, the expectation is there'll be huge numbers for the debate itself, but I think it's fair to say an awful lot of people will watch only part of the debate or will get their information later on from headlines, from whatever clip goes viral. How important are those moments potentially tomorrow night, those moments that everyone will be watching?
Yeah, it may feel shallow and it may feel deceptive, but in fact, that's what the reality of modern politics is. We've seen time and time again, instant polls at the end of a presidential debate often show what the voters think at the moment is different than what becomes the received wisdom afterwards about who won. And partly that's because of some viral moment. And we didn't have anywhere near the ability that we do today through social media to create viral moments out of what may happen at this debate. And it'll be interesting to see the debate after the debate, the argument about what's the most important moment, what gains traction, what finds an audience in the broader ecosphere of our politics today. And I think that's, in a way, the contest after the contest will be as interesting as what we see on stage in the immediate moment.
It would certainly be a moment, Gabe Gutierrez, if this debate came along with a VP announcement from Donald Trump. Nobody knows what's going to happen for sure, except Donald Trump. But what do we think we know?
Well, there, Chris. Yep, it could happen or it could not. For people familiar with the situation, tell NBC News that the timeline, there have been high-level discussions within the Trump campaign of perhaps shifting the timeline of this VP pick potentially as early as this week. Now, all those caveats you mentioned, Chris, that's right. The timing is fluid, and really it's all up to Donald Trump. But you'll remember, Chris, that former President Trump, he actually said that he would reveal his vice presidential pick sometime around the Republican National Convention, which is in mid-July. But again, now it could happen as early as this week, according to the people familiar with the situation. And we've been reporting that the top contenders here are Doug Burgum and Senators J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. Here's what J.D. Vance said in a pre-taped interview that aired this morning.
I think they reached out to a lot of people. I'm among them, and that basically said, hey, send us some information. My best guess is they're looking at me, and they're looking at a lot of other people too, and they'll ask me if they ask me. And if they don't, that's fine. I'm human, right? And so when you know this thing's a possibility, if it doesn't happen, there's certainly going to be a little bit of disappointment.
And overnight, former President Trump said in his own interview that he expected to reveal his vice presidential decision, quote, fairly soon. We do know, Chris, that those three top contenders are expected here at the debate in Atlanta.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.